one civilian death, one fragmented investigation, one unprecedented literary legacy. The early 19th century documentation remains the sole window into an institutional failure that inadvertently forged a new genre of fiction. The case of Mary Rogers begins in Manhattan in the antebellum era. The municipal landscape of Lower Manhattan in the late 1830s and early 1840s was defined by an acute demographic explosion, wherein the physical boundaries of the city struggled to contain a rapidly expanding working class, alongside an increasingly affluent commercial elite. The cobblestone corridors of Lower Broadway served as the central artery of this urban ecosystem, a thoroughfare where high-ranking politicians, prominent journalists from Printing House Square, and affluent financiers crossed paths daily with transient sailors, industrial laborers, and street vendors. This was a society undergoing a turbulent transformation, moving from a provincial port town into a dense, vertical metropolis characterized by stark economic disparities and a stark lack of civic infrastructure. The daily existence of the populace was dictated by the rhythms of commerce, the constant influx of European immigrants, and the pervasive presence of partisan newspapers that had newly begun to commodify local crime and public scandal for mass consumption. Yet, beneath the veneer of commercial prosperity lay a profoundly fragile municipal order, operating without a modern, centralized police force, relying instead on an archaic and highly fragmented system of municipal watchmen who were structurally incapable of maintaining order across the rapidly expanding wards. The precise trajectory of the young woman who would become the center of this municipal crisis is not established in the sources recovered from the period. Her early childhood within the rural boundaries of Connecticut remains entirely unrecorded in surviving civic registries, leaving her early development a matter of historical blankness. It is not documented how she navigated the transition from her birthplace to the dense urban environment of Manhattan following the sudden, violent demise of her father in a maritime accident. Her internal life, her personal ambitions, and her private grievances are not established in the sources recovered, leaving posterity with only the public exterior of a woman whose identity was swiftly appropriated by the commercial press. What remains visible in the archival record is merely her employment at a prominent tobacco shop owned by John Anderson on Lower Broadway, where her presence was deliberately leveraged to attract the custom of influential men, thereby transforming a private individual into a highly visible public commodity known widely across the wards as the beautiful cigar girl. The domestic arrangement that structured her daily life centered upon a crowded boarding house located on Nassau Street, an establishment managed directly by her widowed mother, Phoebe Rogers. Within these walls, the boundaries between private domesticity and commercial lodging were perpetually blurred, as the property housed a rotating roster of young, unmarried men who rented rooms while pursuing trades within the city. This domestic space was characterized by a constant lack of privacy, where the movements, correspondence, and associations of the young woman were subject to the continuous scrutiny of both her parent and the various lodgers who inhabited the premises. It was within this environment that she formed a binding emotional and legal alliance, entering into a formal engagement with a local artisan whose livelihood was directly tied to the city's manual trades. This individual, Daniel Payne, was employed as a professional cork cutter, a demanding manual trade that required long hours of labor within the city's light industrial sectors. The historical records describe him as a man of ordinary height and sober dress, whose personal circumstances were increasingly complicated by a profound dependency on alcohol, a trait that frequently destabilized his domestic relations and professional standing. His history within the boarding house was one of volatile attachment, characterized by a persistent anxiety regarding the numerous wealthy admirers who frequented the tobacco shop where his fiancée was employed. This professional instability, combined with the social pressures of navigating an engagement to a highly public figure in the mid-19th century metropolis, placed an immense strain upon his personal conduct, leaving him increasingly vulnerable to bouts of severe depression and public erratic behavior. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, back to the record. The internal stability of the domestic arrangement was progressively undermined by an accumulation of acute financial anxieties and interpersonal friction, driven in large part by the persistent intervention of former suitors who continued to reside within or frequent the Nassau Street property. Prominent among these figures was Alfred Crommelin, a clerk whose previous romantic overtures had been formally rejected by the young woman, yet who remained an active, observant presence within her immediate social circle. The tension within the household was further exacerbated by the volatile economic climate of the era, which made the maintenance of the boarding house an increasingly precarious financial venture for the widowed mother. The friction between the cork cutter's possessive behavioral patterns and the young woman's continued public visibility created a domestic atmosphere marked by unspoken grievances, an environment wherein a minor deviation from daily routine could trigger a profound domestic rupture. This private volatility unfolded against a broader backdrop of intense national and municipal transformation, an era when the state of New York was grappling with the profound social consequences of rapid urbanization and institutional obsolescence. The year 1841 stood as a moment of profound political realignment, as the state government under Governor William Seward faced mounting public pressure to address the rampant rise of urban street gangs and the total inadequacy of the city's law enforcement apparatus. The existing system, comprised of a rudimentary night watch, fewer than 100 city marshals, and a handful of independent constables, was notoriously corrupt, highly politicized, and entirely unequipped to manage a population exceeding 300,000 residents. This institutional vacuum allowed criminal elements to operate with relative impunity across the waterfronts, while the burgeoning penny press weaponized the public's growing fear of urban lawlessness to increase circulation, thereby turning every unresolved street crime into a direct indictment of the municipal government. The events of late July 1841 transpired with a clinical, stark finality that the subsequent judicial inquiries could never fully illuminate. On the morning of Sunday, July 25th, the young woman departed the Nassau Street boarding house, having informed her fiancé that she intended to cross the city to visit an aunt residing in another quarter. The exact nature of her journey remains entirely unverified by subsequent depositions, as no reliable witness could definitively place her on the public omnibus she was assumed to have boarded. It is hypothesized by later investigators that she may never have intended to visit her relative, but rather sought out a clandestine appointment with an unidentified associate, possibly a medical practitioner or a secret suitor. The documentation fails to establish her movements throughout the afternoon, leaving a complete narrative void that spans several days, during which her absolute absence went largely uninvestigated by a family accustomed to her occasional brief disappearances. The subsequent actions taken by those involved in the concealment and disposal of her remains were executed with a deliberate, procedural precision designed to exploit the natural geographic barriers of the harbor. At some point during the 48 hours following her disappearance, the lifeless body was transported by water, likely within a small skiff or rowboat launched from an isolated point along the Manhattan waterfront under the cover of darkness. The clothing on the deceased was systematically manipulated to ensure the remains would sink beneath the surface, with a heavy piece of lace torn from her own garments tied tightly around her throat to function as a ligature, while her outer garments were bound to her frame. The torso was then cast into the deep, tidal currents of the Hudson River, an environment chosen specifically because the natural flow of the water was expected to carry the evidence out toward the open sea, thereby erasing all physical traces of the deed. The discovery of the remains, however, occurred entirely by chance, arising from the recreational activities of ordinary citizens rather than any coordinated institutional search. On the afternoon of Wednesday, July 28, 3 local men operating a small rowboat for pleasure near the New Jersey shore observed a large object floating intermittently on the water's surface near a popular weekend resort area known as the Elysian Fields in Hoboken. Upon pulling closer, they discovered the badly decomposed corpse of a young female, floating face upward near a landmark known locally as Sybil's Cave. They towed the remains to the rocky shoreline, where the body lay exposed under the summer sun for a considerable duration before a local magistrate could be summoned from his private residence to assume jurisdiction over the scene. The subsequent investigation proceeded chronologically through a series of disjointed, highly disorganized steps that highlighted the complete absence of a centralized detective authority. Initially, the New Jersey authorities treated the matter as a localized drowning, but the arrival of Alfred Crommelin, who had crossed the river independently after reading vague rumors in the early editions, altered the course of the inquiry. Crommelin positively identified the remains as those of the missing cigar girl, basing his conclusion on specific physical characteristics, including the patterns of her attire and the distinct markings on her arms. Following this identification, a chaotic multi-jurisdictional scramble ensued, with Manhattan constables, New Jersey magistrates, and private citizens launching uncoordinated inquiries that frequently contaminated the primary scenes and resulted in the collection of wildly contradictory depositions. The process of apprehending potential suspects relied almost entirely on public denunciation and chance recognition rather than systematic police work. Joseph Morse, a transient laborer who happened to be traveling north, was arrested as far away as Worcester, Massachusetts, simply because an alert citizen believed his physical description matched a vague profile published in a sensational broadsheet. Back in Manhattan, the constables executed a series of sudden warrants, briefly detaining the prominent tobacco shop owner, John Anderson, before releasing him due to a total absence of corroborating evidence connecting him to the waterfront. The fiancé, Daniel Payne, was subjected to intense public scrutiny and multiple informal interrogations by the Night Watch, yet no formal charges could be sustained against him, leaving the state's legal apparatus at a complete standstill while the public demanded an immediate resolution. The post-mortem examination was conducted under primitive conditions on the shoreline by a local practitioner whose technical testimony was preserved in the subsequent municipal records. The medical officer noted extensive tumefaction of the facial features, which rendered visual identification exceptionally difficult, alongside severe bruising about the neck that indicated the application of a violent, continuous pressure. The lungs contained a notable absence of fluid, a technical detail that led the examiner to conclude definitively that death had occurred prior to the immersion of the body in the river. Furthermore, the precise measurements of the deep abrasions on the wrists and torso suggested that the victim had been bound tightly with cords during the fatal assault, pointing to the involvement of multiple perpetrators or a protracted struggle. The formal inquest concluded with a swift, highly ambiguous verdict that reflected the limitations of the gathered evidence. The coroner's jury, assembled hastily in New Jersey, returned a finding that the deceased had come to her death by strangulation at the hands of a person or persons unknown, explicitly flagging the presence of extreme physical violation. This verdict immediately ignited a furious media war in Manhattan, with the New York Herald openly accusing the municipal authorities of deliberate incompetence and suggesting that the crime was the work of an organized urban gang. The public clamor reached such a height that Governor Seward took the extraordinary step of offering a substantial state reward for the conviction of the guilty parties, yet the legal machinery remained entirely paralyzed by the lack of a credible defendant. A formal trial was never realized in the Supreme Court of the state, as the prosecution was never able to assemble a legally coherent case against any single individual. The legal files show that while grand juries were cleared to receive evidence, the absolute failure of the watchmen to secure physical clues or establish a verifiable timeline prevented the district attorney from entering a formal indictment. The defense counsel retained by the various short-term detainees successfully argued that the state's entire narrative was built upon journalistic conjecture rather than admissible forensic proof. Consequently, no jury was ever impaneled to hear the case, and the legal proceedings dissolved into a series of administrative dismissals, leaving the judicial record permanently incomplete. The absence of a judicial resolution produced a tragic secondary casualty that the state authorities recorded with clinical detachment. On the morning of October 7, 1841, Daniel Payne traveled to the New Jersey shore, walking directly to the vicinity of Sybil's Cave, the exact geographic location where his fiancée's body had been brought ashore. Sitting upon a bench near the water, he consumed a lethal dose of laudanum, a powerful opium tincture he had purchased legally within the city. His body was discovered later that afternoon by passing tourists, with a brief, handwritten note preserved in his pocket that read, "To the world, here I am, on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life." The local magistrate ruled the death a suicide brought on by severe mental distress, closing the inquiry without further legal recourse. The final administrative disposition of the matter occurred in late 1842, when an elderly innkeeper named Frederica Loss made a deathbed declaration to a New Jersey justice of the peace. Loss alleged that the young woman had arrived at her tavern in the company of a young physician on the afternoon of her disappearance, and had subsequently expired during an illicit, botched medical procedure designed to terminate a pregnancy. According to this testimony, the body was systematically mutilated and cast into the river by the physician and the innkeeper's sons to protect the reputation of the establishment. The legal authorities, viewing the statement with deep skepticism due to the innkeeper's failing cognitive state, declined to pursue the remaining leads, and the file was formally archived as an unresolved mystery. The institutional legacy of the matter, however, proved profound, fundamentally altering the trajectory of both municipal governance and global literature. The public outrage over the absolute failure of the Night Watch to solve the case became the primary catalyst for the comprehensive structural reform of urban law enforcement, directly contributing to the passage of the landmark Municipal Police Act of 1844, which abolished the old watch system and established the first unified professional police force in New York City. Concurrently, the case captivated a struggling author named Edgar Allan Poe, who meticulously analyzed the newspaper transcripts from his residence in Philadelphia, transforming the topography of Manhattan into 19th-century Paris and renaming the victim Marie Rogêt. Poe composed The Mystery of Marie Rogêt, an extraordinary literary experiment that established the structural conventions of the modern detective story by demonstrating how analytical ratiocination could be applied to real-world criminal records. The case of Mary Rogers was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was never entered. The execution was never carried out. In 1841, the case became part of the national record. It has not left.